blood on the pavement. Groceries scattered like fallen stars. A 73-year-old woman's body crumpled against cold concrete while a badge glinted in the morning sun. This is the story of how one moment of brutality awakened a nation, and how a racist cop's worst nightmare became reality when he discovered his victim wasn't just some old black woman. She was a war hero, a mother, and her son commanded the most lethal military unit America has ever created. Stay until the end and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning of October 14th started like any other Tuesday in the sweet Auburn district of Atlanta, Georgia. The sun climbed lazy and golden over Martin Luther King Jr. Drive painting the brick facades of century-old buildings in warm amber light. Street vendors were setting up their tables, the smell of fresh coffee and peach cobbler drifting from Mama June's soul kitchen on the corner. Children in navy blue uniforms walked in clusters toward the elementary school, their laughter ringing like wind chimes in the crisp autumn air. At exactly 7:47 a.m., 73-year-old Marlene Westfield stepped out of Green's family grocery with 2 brown paper bags cradled in her arms. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her posture straight despite her age, a remnant of her 20 years as a field medic in conflicts most Americans had never heard of. She wore a lavender cardigan her granddaughter had sent her last Christmas, comfortable walking shoes, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to believe in its best. She didn't know she had less than 3 minutes to live her life as she knew it. Marlene paused on the sidewalk, shifting the bags to get a better grip. One contained fresh collard greens, cornmeal, and the ingredients for her famous peach pie. The other held her medications, a carton of eggs, and a small bouquet of sunflowers. Tuesday flowers, she called them, because Tuesdays needed brightening up. "Morning, Mrs. Westfield," called Jerome, the teenager who stocked shelves at Green's. He was standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron. "Morning, baby," she replied with a warm smile. "You tell your mama I'll bring by that recipe she asked for." "Yes, ma'am. You need help with those bags." "Child, I carried wounded soldiers through the Mekong Delta. I think I can handle some groceries." Jerome grinned. Everyone in the neighborhood knew better than to underestimate Mrs. Westfield. She might look like somebody's sweet grandmother, but she had stories that could curl your hair and a backbone made of Tennessee steel. Marlene started down the sidewalk, heading toward her apartment 3 blocks away. The morning was perfect, cool enough to be comfortable, warm enough to feel the sun on your face. She was thinking about her son, wondering if he was eating right wherever in the world his work had taken him. She hadn't heard from Bryson in 2 weeks, which wasn't unusual. His job required silence. She'd learned long ago not to worry, to trust that he was built from the same unbreakable material she was. She was halfway down the block when she heard it. Hey, you!" The voice was sharp, aggressive, cutting through the morning peace like a cleaver through meat. Marlene slowed, but didn't stop. She'd lived in Atlanta for 50 years. She knew that tone. Nothing good ever followed it. "I'm talking to you. Stop right there." This time, she did stop, turning slowly. Her first thought was annoyance. She was 73 years old, carrying groceries, clearly not running from anything. Her second thought, the one that made her stomach tighten, came when she saw who was yelling. Officer Cole Brennan. She'd seen him before, prowling the neighborhood in his patrol car like a shark in shallow water. He was 32, built like a linebacker with a crew cut so severe it looked like punishment, and eyes that held all the warmth of a winter parking lot. He'd been on the Atlanta PD for 7 years, and in that time he'd racked up 14 formal complaints, all dismissed, all buried in the bureaucratic machinery that protected bad cops the way a shell protects a nut. "I said stop!" Brennan barked, his hand already drifting toward his belt, not to his gun, but to his nightstick. Some cops reached for guns. Brennan preferred the stick. More personal. More control. Marlene set down her grocery bags carefully, precisely, in that way people do when they're trying to buy time to think. Around her, she could feel the neighborhood holding its breath. Mr. Chen, who'd been sweeping the sidewalk in front of his hardware store, backed into his doorway. Two women across the street suddenly found urgent business inside the nail salon. Jerome disappeared from Green's entrance. Everyone knew the drill. When Cole Brennan was involved, you made yourself scarce. "Can I help you, officer?" Marlene's voice was steady, polite, with the carefully neutral tone Black Americans have perfected over generations. The voice that says, "I'm not a threat. I'm not challenging you. Please let this end peacefully." "You can help me by showing some respect," Brennan said, closing the distance between them with aggressive strides. "I called you 3 times. You deaf or just stupid?" Marlene felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders, that exhausting burden of having to be perfect, composed, unthreatening, even in the face of disrespect. She'd felt it in military briefings when male officers talked over her. She'd felt it in hospitals when doctors assumed she was a janitor, not a medic. She'd felt it every day of her life in America. "I apologize, officer. I didn't realize you were addressing me. What can I do for you?" "You can start by saying sir when you talk to me." The word hung in the air like a noose. Marlene looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the aggressive stance, the fingers drumming on his nightstick, the slight sneer playing at the corner of his mouth. She'd seen his type before in every war zone, every conflict, every place where power met vulnerability. Men who wore authority like armor because underneath they were terrified of their own insignificance. And in that moment, something shifted in her. Maybe it was 73 years of swallowing indignity. Maybe it was the memory of treating soldiers who died defending the very freedoms this man was violating. Maybe it was just Tuesday morning exhaustion, the weariness of having to prostrate yourself before a badge to buy groceries in your own neighborhood. "Officer," she said quietly, "I meant no disrespect. But I'm not in the military anymore, and neither are you my commanding officer. I've addressed you politely. Now, if there's no official business, I'd like to continue home." The change in Brennan's face was instantaneous. His jaw clenched, his eyes went flat and cold, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that meant someone was about to get hurt. "Oh, we got official business now, Grandma. You just got real official." "Officer Brennan, That's sir to you." He moved forward so fast, Marlene barely had time to process it. His hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with bruising force, and suddenly she was being yanked forward. Her careful balance destroyed her body at the mercy of his momentum. "Let me go!" The words came out sharp, louder than she'd intended, and she saw his eyes light up with something that made her blood freeze. Pleasure. "Resisting arrest," Brennan said, and there was excitement in his voice, the thrill of someone who'd been waiting for an excuse. "You're resisting arrest." "I'm not." "I didn't." Marlene tried to pull back, and that's when she felt it. The nightstick. He'd pulled it free with his other hand, and now it was rising, and her medic's brain, trained to assess injury, to calculate damage, was screaming at her to protect her head, to turn to. The first blow caught her in the ribs. Pain exploded through her chest like fireworks. She gasped, tried to breathe, couldn't. Her knees buckled, but Brennan still had her arm, was still holding her up like a puppet, and she heard him say something, but couldn't make out the words through the ringing in her ears. The second blow hit her shoulder. She felt something crack. "Please," she managed to whisper. "Please stop." Should have said Sir Grandma. Should have shown some respect. The third blow was aimed at her head. Marlene tried to turn, tried to protect herself, but she was 73 years old, and he was a trained officer, and the world was tilting sideways, and the nightstick connected with the side of her skull with a sound like a hammer on a melon. Everything went white, then red, then gray. She was falling. She knew she was falling, could feel gravity taking her, could feel the sidewalk rushing up to meet her face, but she seemed to be falling in slow motion, watching it happen to someone else's body. She hit the concrete face first. The sound of her cheekbone breaking was surprisingly quiet, just a small crack, like a pencil snapping. Blood began to pool beneath her head, spreading across the sidewalk in a dark halo. Her sunflowers had scattered from the bag, lying in a broken yellow circle around her still form. The eggs had shattered, mixing their golden yolks with her red blood in an obscene painting on the gray concrete. For a long moment, the entire street was silent. Then Brennan started talking, and his voice was different now. Higher, faster, touched with something that might have been panic or might have been adrenaline. Suspect attacked officer. Repeat suspect attacked officer. Requesting backup and medical at the corner of Auburn and... But before he could finish, before the lies could fully crystallize into official record, a voice cut through the morning air. "You're lying." Brennan spun around. Standing on the steps of Green's grocery phone held high was Jerome. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady, and the phone's camera was pointed directly at the scene. "I recorded the whole thing," Jerome said. "You attacked her. She didn't do nothing. She's 73 years old, and you beat her like a... Give me that phone, now!" Brennan started toward him. "I already uploaded it. It's already out there." Jerome was backing up, but he didn't run. "Everybody's gonna see what you did." More people were emerging now, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Chen with his phone out. The women from the nail salon. A UPS driver who'd stopped his truck in the middle of the street. They formed a loose circle around Marlene's unconscious body, not helping nobody wanted to be next, but bearing witness. Being present. Making sure this moment didn't disappear into the void where so many other moments had vanished. Brennan looked around at the phones, at the faces, at the evidence multiplying by the second, and something cracked in his expression. He grabbed his radio again. "Officer under duress. Hostile crowd. Need immediate backup at Auburn and..." 3 patrol cars arrived within 90 seconds, sirens wailing. Officers poured out hands on weapons, shouting commands. "Back up! Everyone! Back up! Let us work!" Creating a perimeter of authority that pushed the witnesses back until they were just faces in the crowd, just people with phones who could be dismissed as unreliable, emotional, not credible. By the time the ambulance arrived, the official story was already being written. Marlene Westfield, 73, had become aggressive when questioned about suspicious behavior. She had struck Officer Brennan. She had resisted arrest. She had fallen during the altercation, striking her head on the pavement. Officer Brennan had acted within protocol to subdue a violent suspect. The EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, whispered to her partner, "Jesus Christ, look at her face. What the hell happened here?" "Don't know, don't ask," he muttered back. "Just transport." As the ambulance pulled away, sirens screaming, Brennan stood on the sidewalk surrounded by his fellow officers. They were clapping him on the back, telling him he did good, asking if he was okay, treating him like the victim. He looked down at the blood on the pavement, so much blood for one old woman, and for just a second, something flickered across his face. Not quite regret. Not quite fear. Something else. Then it was gone, replaced by the righteous certainty of a man who knows the system will protect him. It always had. It always would. He didn't know that 2 blocks away, in an apartment above a laundromat, Mrs. Gladys Morrison was uploading Jerome's video to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. She was 76 years old and had just learned how to use hashtags from her grandson. Justice for Marlene began trending within the hour. He didn't know that at Grady Memorial Hospital, a trauma nurse named Laura Chen, no relation to the hardware store owner, was looking at Marlene's injuries with growing horror and thinking, "This doesn't match the report. This doesn't match at all." He didn't know that among the scattered contents of Marlene's purse, there was an old military ID card from her service in Vietnam and a faded photograph of a young man in dress blues, his face serious and proud, his eyes holding the same quiet strength as his mother's. And he absolutely didn't know that at that exact moment, 847 miles away, in a classified facility, buried beneath the New Mexico desert, a digital alert was flashing on a classified server. The alert read, "Marlene Westfield. Emergency contact activated." In a command center that officially didn't exist, a communications officer looked at the alert, looked at the medical codes attached to it, and felt his stomach drop. "Sir," he said quietly, "you need to see this." The man he was addressing stood with his back to the room, studying a tactical display. He was tall, built like his mother, lean and strong, with that same straight-backed posture that came from years of discipline. His uniform bore no name tag, no rank insignia, nothing that would identify him. In his world, anonymity was survival. But everyone in that room knew exactly who he was. General Bryson Westfield, commander of Black Phantom, the most elite and lethal special operations unit in the American military, turned around slowly. "Report," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a man trained to make life-or-death decisions in microseconds. "It's your mother, sir. There's been an incident. She's in critical condition at Grady Memorial in Atlanta. Head trauma, broken bones, internal bleeding." Bryson's expression didn't change, didn't flicker. To anyone who didn't know him, he might have looked completely unmoved. But the communications officer had served under Bryson Westfield for 6 years. He knew that absolute stillness. He'd seen it once before in Kabul, right before Bryson had walked alone into a building holding 12 hostages and emerged 20 minutes later with all the hostages safe and every terrorist dead. "How?" Bryson said, and that single word contained volumes. "Police incident, sir. Details are unclear, but there's video. It's spreading online. Sir, you need to see it." Bryson walked to the monitor. The officer pulled up Jerome's footage. And for the next 2 minutes and 47 seconds, General Bryson Westfield, who had survived ambushes in Fallujah, firefights in Mogadishu, operations in places that would never appear in history books, watched a police officer beat his mother unconscious on a sunny Atlanta street corner. He watched her try to reason with Brennan. He watched her try to pull away. He watched the nightstick rise and fall. He watched her face hit the concrete. When the video ended, the command center was absolutely silent. Bryson stood motionless for exactly 10 seconds. Then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet everyone had to strain to hear it. "Get me a transport to Atlanta. Immediate departure." "Sir, we're in the middle of—" "Now." "Yes, sir." Bryson walked toward the exit, then paused. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, and somehow that made it more terrifying. "Pull every piece of data we have on Officer Cole Brennan, every file, every complaint, every incident report that was buried or dismissed. Pull his financials, his communications, his associates. I want to know every racist joke he ever told, every corner he ever cut, every person he ever hurt." "Sir, that's—" "I didn't ask what it was. I told you what I need." "Sir?" "Yes, sir." Bryson reached the door, then looked back one more time. "And someone tell the team. Tell them Protocol Ironstone is active." One of the younger officers looked confused. "Sir, Ironstone is for—" "I know what it's for," Bryson said. "It's for when the system fails. It's for when justice needs a push. It's for when the rules that are supposed to protect people are being used to hurt them instead." He paused. "It's for my mother." Then he was gone, and the command center erupted into controlled chaos. Computers hummed to life. Secure lines opened. Analysts began pulling data from servers most Americans didn't know existed. Black Phantom was designed to fight America's enemies abroad. But sometimes the enemy was already inside the walls. At Grady Memorial Hospital, Marlene Westfield lay in the ICU machines, breathing for her monitors, tracking the slow, steady rhythm of a heart that had survived 73 years of life and wasn't ready to quit yet. Nurse Laura Chen checked her vitals, adjusted her IV, and looked at the medical report that had accompanied her from the ambulance. "Patient fell while resisting arrest," it said. Laura looked at Marlene's face, at the massive contusion on her skull, the broken orbital bone, the pattern of injuries that screamed blunt force trauma, not a fall. She looked at the bruises on Marlene's arm, perfectly shaped like fingers, like someone had grabbed her, like someone had held her. Then Laura did something that would cost her nothing and might save everything. She took out her phone and photographed every injury. She copied the medical charts. She made note of every inconsistency between the official report and what she was seeing. And when her shift ended, she drove home and sent everything to her cousin, who happened to be an attorney with the ACLU. The pieces were falling into place. The truth was assembling itself. And in the ICU, hooked to machines and lost in darkness, Marlene Westfield's lips moved almost imperceptibly, forming words no one could hear. Don't call him, don't let him know. But it was too late. Her son already knew, and he was coming home. The flight from New Mexico to Atlanta took 4 hours and 17 minutes. But for Bryson Westfield, every minute felt like drowning in slow motion. He sat alone in the cargo hold of a C-130 transport, surrounded by darkness and the steady roar of engines, his mind replaying that video on an endless loop. The nightstick rising, his mother's body crumpling, the blood spreading across concrete like spilled paint. He'd seen violence before. God knows he'd seen enough violence to fill several lifetimes. He'd pulled dead children from rubble in Syria. He'd watched good men die in his arms in Afghanistan. He'd killed with his own hands when killing was the only option left. But this was different. This was his mother. This was the woman who'd sung him lullabies and taught him to tie his shoes, and held him when his father died, and told him that strength without compassion was just cruelty wearing a uniform. His phone buzzed. A secure message from his second-in-command Major Sarah Chen, no relation to Laura, though that coincidence would matter later. Data package complete. Brennan's file is worse than we thought. Sending encrypted. Bryson opened the file and started reading. With each page, his jaw tightened further. Cole Brennan, 32 years old. Joined Atlanta PD at 25 after washing out of the Marines for disciplinary issues, a polite way of saying he'd been caught beating a fellow recruit who happened to be black. 14 formal complaints in 7 years. 9 for excessive force, 3 for racial profiling, 2 for sexual harassment. All dismissed, all buried under a mountain of procedural protection and union interference. There were incident reports that had been altered, witness statements that had disappeared, video footage that had mysteriously corrupted. And running through it all like a toxic river was a pattern of racism so blatant it should have ended his career a dozen times over. In 2019, he'd beaten a 17-year-old kid so badly the boy lost vision in one eye. The official report said the kid had assaulted Brennan. 6 witnesses said otherwise. The witnesses were never called to testify. In 2021, he'd pulled over a black woman driving through a white neighborhood and strip-searched her on the side of the road, claiming he smelled marijuana. There was no marijuana. There was a lawsuit that the city settled quietly for an undisclosed sum and a non-disclosure agreement. In 2023, he'd been caught on another officer's body camera using the N-word during a traffic stop. He'd received a written reprimand and a weekend of cultural sensitivity training. And through it all, he'd been promoted, praised, protected by a system that valued the badge over the people it was supposed to serve. Bryson closed the file and leaned his head back against the cold metal wall of the transport. In his world in the shadow operations, he commanded accountability was absolute. You failed your mission, you faced consequences. You betrayed your team, you were gone. You hurt innocent people, you answered for it. But in civilian law enforcement, apparently, you just kept your job. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a number he didn't recognize. General Westfield, my name is Laura Chen. I'm a nurse at Grady Memorial. I'm treating your mother. I need you to know that the official report is false. I have evidence. We need to talk. Bryson stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, landing in 90 minutes. I'll find you. At Grady Memorial Hospital, the ICU hummed with the quiet efficiency of a place where death and life negotiated constantly. Laura Chen moved through her rounds with practiced precision, checking monitors, adjusting IVs, offering small comforts to patients who mostly couldn't respond. But every few minutes, her eyes drifted back to bed 7, where Marlene Westfield lay suspended between consciousness and void. The official chart at the foot of the bed told one story. Laura's eyes told another. You keep staring at that woman like she's a puzzle you're trying to solve. Laura turned to find Dr. Marcus Webb standing behind her coffee cup in hand, exhaustion written across his face. Webb was head of emergency medicine, 58 years old, with silver hair, and the weary wisdom of someone who'd seen every kind of human damage the world could produce. The injuries don't match the report, Laura said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Look at the contusion pattern on her skull. That's not from a fall, that's from being struck repeatedly with something rounded and hard. Webb stepped closer, studying Marlene's chart without touching it. What does the report say? Patient became aggressive during police questioning. Struck officer. Fell during arrest. Head trauma consistent with impact on pavement. And what do you see? Laura pulled up the images on her tablet photos she'd taken during the initial examination. I see defensive wounds on her forearms. I see bruising on her upper arm shaped exactly like finger marks like someone grabbed her. I see a skull fracture that required significant force from a specific angle. And I see a 73-year-old woman who weighs maybe 120 pounds, somehow being classified as an aggressive threat. Webb was quiet for a moment, then he sighed deeply. Laura, I've been doing this for 33 years. You know what I've learned? The reports always lie. Not always completely, but enough. Enough to protect the wrong people. So we just accept it. We just let them rewrite what happened. I didn't say that. Webb looked at Marlene's unconscious form with something that might have been anger or might have been sorrow. I said the reports lie. I didn't say we have to help them lie. What are you saying? I'm saying that when I file my medical assessment, I'm going to note every inconsistency between the injuries and the reported mechanism. I'm saying that if anyone asks me to alter or soften that assessment, I'm going to refuse. And I'm saying that if you happen to thoroughly document everything with photographs and detailed notes, well, that's just exemplary nursing practice, isn't it? Laura felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get complicated. There are a lot of people invested in making sure this story goes away quietly. He paused. Who else knows what you're thinking? I sent everything to my cousin. He's a civil rights attorney. Webb nodded slowly. Good. Chain of evidence. Make it so they can't make it disappear. He turned to leave, then stopped. Laura? Be careful. I've seen what happens to people who challenge the narrative. It's not pretty. After he left, Laura stood alone with Marlene, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, the mechanical sigh of the ventilator. The swelling around Marlene's face had worsened, turning her features into a mask of purple and black. Her silver hair so neatly arranged that morning was matted with blood that the ER team hadn't fully cleaned away. Laura gently adjusted the blanket, a gesture that meant nothing medically, but somehow felt necessary. Your son is coming, she whispered. I don't know what he can do, but he's coming. And then so quietly, Laura almost missed it. Marlene's lips moved. Laura froze, then leaned closer. Mrs. Westfield, can you hear me? The lips moved again, forming words that came out as barely a breath. Don't. Call him. Your son. You don't want us to call your son? Don't. Let him. No. The words were slurred, broken, filtered through layers of sedation and brain trauma, but they carried an urgency that made Laura's heart race. Mrs. Westfield, he already knows. There was an emergency contact protocol. He's dangerous. When he's angry. Marlene's eyes flickered open for just a second, glassy, unfocused, but conscious enough to convey meaning. My boy is dangerous. Then she slipped back under her breathing, evening out, her face going slack again. Laura stood there for a long moment, pulse hammering in her throat, trying to process what she'd just heard. What kind of son was dangerous when angry, in a way that made his mother warn about him, even from the edge of a coma? She pulled out her phone and looked at the text exchange with General Westfield. No profile photo, no information, just a name and a response that said he was coming. Across the hospital, in a waiting room that smelled of industrial cleaner and anxiety, Jerome sat with his mother, his phone clutched in his hands like a talisman. The video had exploded beyond anything he'd imagined. 2 million views in 6 hours. Shares cascading across every platform. News outlets calling his phone, which he'd stopped answering after the first dozen. His mother, Patricia, sat beside him with her arm around his shoulders, her face tight with worry. "Baby, you did the right thing. You know that, right?" "Then why do I feel sick?" Jerome's voice cracked. "Why do I feel like I just put a target on my back?" "Because you probably did." The voice came from the doorway. They both turned to see a man in his 60s, wearing a worn cardigan and carrying a weathered briefcase. But sometimes, wearing a target is the price of telling the truth. "Who are you?" Patricia stood up, placing herself between the stranger and her son. "My name is Robert Ashford. I'm an attorney with the Georgia ACLU, and I'm here because your son just became the most important witness in what's probably going to be the most high-profile police brutality case Atlanta has seen in a decade." He paused. "May I sit down?" Patricia looked at Jerome, who nodded slowly. Ashford settled into one of the plastic chairs with a sigh. "First, let me say this. Jerome, what you did took courage. Real courage. Not the kind they make movies about, but the kind that changes things. That video is already forcing the department to respond, but you need to understand what's coming." "What do you mean?" Jerome asked. "I mean, they're going to try to discredit you. They're going to dig into your background looking for anything they can use. That parking ticket you got last year? That fight you got in at school when you were 14? They're going to make you sound like a criminal. They're going to question your motives. They're going to suggest you edited the video, that you're lying, that you have an agenda." Jerome felt his mother's grip tighten on his shoulder. "So what do? We get ahead of it. We control the narrative. We make sure your story is told truthfully and completely before they can poison it with lies." Ashford opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. "This is a cooperation agreement. If you sign it, the ACLU will represent you pro bono. We'll handle all media requests, all legal questions, all attempts at intimidation. We'll protect you and make sure your testimony can't be dismissed or buried. And if I don't sign it, then you're on your own against a police department with millions of dollars in legal resources and a vested interest in making you disappear from this story." Ashford's face softened. "Look, Jerome, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've seen 100 cases like this. Most of them end with the victim blamed, the witness silenced, and the officer back on the streets. But every once in a while we get a case where everything aligns: evidence, timing, public attention, the right plaintiff, the right witness. This could be one of those cases, but only if you're willing to fight." Jerome looked at the document, then at his mother, then back at Ashford. "Mrs. Westfield, is she going to make it?" "I don't know. The doctors say the next 48 hours are critical. She was always nice to me. Every time she came into the store, she'd ask about school, about my mama, about my plans. She remembered stuff, you know, like she actually cared." Jerome's voice got thick. "She didn't deserve this. Nobody deserves this." "No," Ashford agreed. "They don't, which is why we fight." Jerome picked up the pen. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name. 14 blocks away, in a bar called the Copper Shield that catered exclusively to cops, Officer Cole Brennan was on his 4th beer and feeling pretty damn good about himself. The place was packed with fellow officers, all of them telling him he did the right thing, that he handled it perfectly, that the old bitch got what she deserved. "You should have seen her face when I told her to call me sir." Brennan laughed, his words starting to slur together. "Like she couldn't believe I was talking to her like that, like she thought she was special or something." His partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, raised his beer. "To Cole Brennan, who doesn't take shit from anybody." The table erupted in cheers. Glasses clinked. Someone ordered another round. "What I don't get," said Officer Tommy Garrett from across the table, "is why she had to be so difficult. Like, just say yes, sir, and move on. Why do they always have to make it a thing?" "Because they think the rules don't apply to them anymore," Brennan said, leaning back in his chair. "Because they think they can talk to us however they want, disrespect the badge, and we're just supposed to take it. Well, I don't take it. I never have, and I never will." Reynolds lowered his voice slightly. "You worried about the video? Kid caught the whole thing on camera." Brennan waved a dismissive hand. "Fuck the video. You know what people are gonna see. They're gonna see an officer giving lawful commands and a suspect refusing to comply. They're gonna see her pull away from me, that's resisting arrest right there. And they're gonna see that in the context of a hostile neighborhood where cops get disrespected every damn day. Any jury's gonna side with me." "What about the internal investigation?" "Please, you know how those go. Couple weeks of desk duty, maybe some sensitivity bullshit, then I'm back on the street. The union's got my back, captain's got my back. Hell, half the department thinks I'm a hero." What Brennan didn't know what he couldn't know, because he was 4 beers deep and surrounded by yes-men who'd never challenge him, was that outside in the parking lot, a nondescript sedan with tinted windows had been sitting for the past 20 minutes. Inside were 2 NSA analysts who'd been pulled from their regular duties and given a very specific assignment record: everything Cole Brennan said, everywhere he went, everyone he talked to. The analyst in the passenger seat, a woman named Torres, adjusted her headphones and made a notation on her tablet. "Subject is intoxicated, making multiple admissions regarding the incident. No indication of remorse." Her partner, a man named Rodriguez, checked the audio levels. "How long do we maintain surveillance?" "Until we're told to stop." Torres glanced at the authorization code on her screen. It was marked with a classification she'd never seen before: Phantom Ironstone. "This one's coming from the top, way up top." "Who authorized this?" "Someone who really doesn't like dirty cops, apparently." Inside the bar, Brennan's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, squinting at the screen. A text from his captain. "Need to see you first thing tomorrow. 0700. Don't be late." Brennan showed it to Reynolds. "See, Captain wants to congratulate me personally." Reynolds didn't look so sure. "Maybe. Or maybe he wants to get ahead of the shitstorm. That video's everywhere, Cole. CNN picked it up. It's trending on Twitter. There's already protests being organized." "Let 'em protest. I've got nothing to hide." Brennan finished his beer and signaled for another. "I'm a good cop who did his job. End of story." But even as he said it, something cold slithered through his beer-fueled confidence. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd picked the wrong old woman to mess with this time. He shook it off, ordered another drink, told himself everything was fine. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Bryson Westfield walked through the sliding doors of Grady Memorial Hospital wearing jeans, a plain black jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked like any other visitor, tired, worried, ordinary. Only his eyes gave him away. They moved constantly, cataloging exits and security cameras and potential threats with the automatic precision of someone trained to survive in hostile territory. The night receptionist barely glanced at him. "Visiting hours are over." Bryson pulled out an ID and placed it on the counter without a word. The receptionist looked at it, then looked at him, then looked at the ID again. Her face went pale. "Yes, sir. I'll call up to ICU and let them know you're coming." "Thank you." He took the elevator to the 4th floor alone with his thoughts and the quiet hum of machinery. The doors opened to a hushed corridor dimly lit for night shift, where Laura Chen was waiting for him. They recognized each other instantly, though they'd never met. She knew him by the way he held himself, that coiled readiness that marked him as dangerous even in stillness. He knew her by the intelligence in her eyes and the tablet clutched in her hands like evidence. "General Westfield." "Ms. Chen." "She's stable for now. The swelling in her brain has stabilized, but the next 24 hours are critical. We won't know the full extent of the damage until if she wakes up. Bryson's voice was very quiet. "Can I see her?" "Of course. But first..." Laura handed him the tablet. "You need to see this. All of it." Bryson took the tablet and started scrolling through Laura's documentation. The photographs, the notes, the comparisons between injury patterns and official reports. Every inconsistency laid out with clinical precision. When he finished, he looked up at Laura with eyes that had gone very flat and very cold. "You've made yourself a target by collecting this. I know. They'll come after you. Your job, your reputation may be worse. I know that too." Laura met his gaze without flinching. "I took an oath to do no harm. Letting them bury this would be harm. Letting them lie about what happened to your mother would be harm. So I'm not letting them." For the first time since the video, Bryson felt something other than rage. It was respect, sharp and clean. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Just make sure it matters. Make sure this doesn't disappear like all the others." "It won't." The words came out like a promise and a threat rolled into one. "I guarantee you it won't." Laura led him to Marlene's room. Bryson stopped in the doorway, and for just a moment, the mask cracked. His mother, his strong, unbreakable mother who'd survived war and poverty and widowhood, lay broken in a hospital bed, her face barely recognizable under the swelling and bruising. He walked to her bedside slowly, as if approaching something fragile that might shatter if he moved too quickly. He took her hand, the one not hooked to IVs, and held it gently. "Ma," he whispered. "I'm here. I'm right here." The machines beeped steadily. The ventilator sighed. Marlene didn't respond. Bryson stood there for a long time holding his mother's hand, and something fundamental shifted in him. He'd spent 20 years fighting enemies abroad. Now he understood that some of the worst enemies were already here wearing badges hiding behind qualified immunity protected by a system that valued order over justice. He'd operated in shadows to protect his country. Now he'd bring those shadows home to expose the truth. Laura watched from the doorway, and later she would tell her cousin that she'd never seen anyone look so calm and so terrifying at the same time. Finally, Bryson spoke without turning around. "The officer who did this, Brennan, where is he now?" "Probably at home, or maybe celebrating with his buddies at some cop bar." "Does he know who she is, who I am?" "I don't think so. The emergency contact went through federal channels. It's not in the public records." Bryson nodded slowly. "Good. Let's keep it that way for now." "What are you going to do?" He looked down at his mother's battered face, and when he answered, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm going to make sure he faces every consequence he's spent 7 years avoiding. I'm going to pull back every protection, expose every lie, and let the truth burn everything it touches." And if the system protects him anyway, Bryson finally turned to look at her, and Laura understood why his mother had warned about his anger. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was cold and precise and absolutely implacable. "Then," he said quietly, "I'll remind the system who it's supposed to serve." Bryson spent the night in his mother's hospital room, sitting in the visitor's chair that was too small for his frame, watching the monitors trace her heartbeat in green electric arcs across black screens. He didn't sleep. He'd gone longer without sleep in worse places, and right now, sleep felt like surrender, like looking away when he needed to see everything. At 0400 hours, he pulled out his encrypted phone and made a call that bounced through 3 satellites and 2 secure relays before connecting to a voice he'd known for 15 years. "Sarah," he said quietly, mindful of the nurses outside. "It's time." Major Sarah Chen's voice was alert despite the hour. She never really slept either. "Ironstone is active. We've got eyes on Brennan, his partner Reynolds, and 17 other officers in their precinct who've had excessive force complaints in the last 3 years. NSA's feeding us their communications, financials, social media, everything. You want the preliminary? Give it to me. Brennan's dirty as hell, but you already knew that. What you didn't know is he's part of a group unofficial off the books about 30 officers across the Atlanta PD who basically operate like a gang. They cover for each other, falsify reports, intimidate witnesses. They've got a group chat where they share, "Jesus, Bryson, you need to see this to believe it." Racist memes, jokes about planting evidence, bragging about roughing up suspects. It's all there. Bryson's jaw tightened. Can we prove it? We can prove all of it. The question is, how much you want to expose, and when. I want everything exposed. Every lie, every cover-up, every complaint that got buried. I want it so clear, so documented, so irrefutable that even the system can't protect them anymore. There was a pause on the other end. Bryson, you know what you're asking for here. This isn't some terrorist cell we're taking down. This is American law enforcement. There are jurisdictional issues, legal boundaries. I know exactly what I'm asking for. His voice was soft, but carried an edge that could cut steel. Protocol Ironstone exists for when domestic systems fail to protect American citizens from domestic threats. My mother is an American citizen. She served her country in Vietnam. And a domestic threat put her in a coma because she wouldn't call him sir. If that's not a failure of the system, I don't know what is. Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to pure operational efficiency. Understood. How do you want to proceed? Stage 1. Let the video and the evidence build organic pressure. Let the public outrage grow naturally. Don't interfere, just document everything. And Stage 2. Stage 2 is when I pay Officer Brennan a visit. Bryson, I'm not going to hurt him, Sarah. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to make him face what he did in front of everyone who's been protecting him. After he hung up, Bryson sat in the dim room and watched dawn creep across Atlanta through the hospital window. Somewhere out there, Cole Brennan was sleeping peacefully, confident in his immunity, sure that this would blow over like all the others. He had no idea the storm that was gathering. By 0700 hours, when Brennan walked into Captain Mitchell's office at the precinct, the first cracks were already showing. The captain was a thick-built man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and a face that had settled into permanent exhaustion. He didn't stand when Brennan entered, didn't offer coffee, didn't do any of the usual collegial rituals. "Sit down, Cole." Brennan sat still, carrying yesterday's confidence like armor. "Captain, about yesterday." "Shut up and listen." Mitchell's voice was flat. "Do you have any idea how bad this is? That video has 15 million views. 15 million. CNN's running it every hour. There's a protest being organized for tonight outside this building. The mayor's office has called me 6 times. The DA's calling for an independent investigation. It's all bullshit, Cap. You saw my report. She assaulted me, I subdued her. Everything was by the book." "By the book?" Mitchell pulled up something on his computer and turned the screen around. It was Jerome's video paused on the moment when Marlene's face hit the pavement. "Does that look by the book to you? Does a 73-year-old woman bleeding on the sidewalk look like proper use of force?" She was resisting. She was carrying groceries. Mitchell's composure cracked. She was an elderly woman walking home from the store, and you beat her into a coma because she didn't show you enough respect. Do you understand how that looks? Do you understand what you've done to this department? Brennan felt something cold slither into his chest. "So what, you're throwing me under the bus? After 7 years of having my back, you're just gonna—" "I don't have a choice anymore, Cole. This isn't going away. The union's already distancing themselves. Internal Affairs is opening a full investigation, and this time they can't bury it because the whole world is watching." Mitchell leaned forward. "You're suspended effective immediately. Badge and gun. Now." "You can't be serious." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Brennan stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "This is bullshit. I'm a good cop. I've closed more cases than anyone in my unit. I've put criminals away, while the rest of you sit around worrying about optics and political correctness. You put an innocent woman in the hospital. She wasn't innocent. None of them are innocent. They're all—" Brennan caught himself, but not fast enough. Go ahead, Mitchell said coldly. Finish that sentence. Tell me what they all are. Brennan's face flushed red. He could feel the trap closing, but couldn't stop himself. They're all the same. Always playing victim, always crying racism, always looking for a payday. Well, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of walking on eggshells in my own city, sick of pretending they deserve respect when they don't respect us. That old woman. She's nobody. She's just some old black hag who thought she was too good to follow orders. The silence that followed was absolute. Mitchell stared at him like he'd never seen him before. Get out of my office. Get out of this building. And pray to God that statement doesn't end up recorded somewhere, because if it does, your career is over. But it was already too late. Outside Captain Mitchell's office, Officer Lisa Martinez stood frozen with her phone in her hand. She'd been about to knock to deliver some paperwork when she'd heard Brennan's voice rising. Heard every word, and without quite deciding to do it, she'd pressed record. Her hands were shaking as she stared at the audio file. She'd served with Cole Brennan for 3 years. She'd watched him operate, watched him get away with things that turned her stomach. Watched good officers stay silent because challenging him meant becoming a target. She'd stayed silent too, telling herself it wasn't her problem, that someone else would handle it, that speaking up would only destroy her career. But standing there with his words captured in her phone, just some old black hag, she realized silence had its own cost. She uploaded the audio to a secure email account and sent it to 5 different news organizations with a simple subject line: Atlanta PD officer's true feelings about assault victim. Then she walked to the bathroom and threw up. The audio hit the internet at 9:23 a.m. By 9:45, it was trending nationwide. By 10:00, every major news outlet was playing it on loop, and Atlanta was preparing to explode. Bryson heard it in the hospital cafeteria, standing in line for coffee he didn't want. The television mounted in the corner was tuned to CNN, and suddenly there was Brennan's voice, tinny but clear, saying words that made every person in that cafeteria stop and stare. She's just some old black hag. The woman in front of Bryson in line, a young black nurse with tired eyes, made a sound like she'd been punched. An older white man near the windows said, "Jesus Christ," and set down his coffee cup with a hand that shook. Bryson pulled out his phone and called Sarah. "Tell me you got that." "Every word. We've already cross-referenced it with body camera footage from other incidents. Bryson, we can prove a pattern. This isn't just one bad moment, this is who he is." "Good. Leak everything you have to Robert Ashford at the ACLU. Make sure he has ammunition." "Already done. But Bryson, there's something else. We've been monitoring social media. There's a protest forming. It's happening tonight at 6 p.m., starting at the precinct and marching to the hospital. They're expecting thousands." Bryson looked at the TV screen where a Black Lives Matter organizer was speaking into a reporter's microphone. "This isn't just about Marlene Westfield. This is about every person who's been brutalized by officers who think the badge means they can act with impunity. We march tonight. We march until there's justice." "Let them march," Bryson said quietly. "The people need to be heard. And you? What's your play?" "I'm going to the precinct. Right now." "Bryson, that's not—" "I'm not asking for permission, Sarah. I'm telling you what's happening." He hung up before she could argue and walked out of the cafeteria. As he passed the elevators, he saw Laura Chen standing with a group of nurses, all of them staring at their phones, several crying. Laura caught his eye and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity, of understanding. The Atlanta Police Department's 7th Precinct was a squat concrete building that looked more like a bunker than a place of public service. Bryson walked through the front doors at 10:47 a.m., wearing the same civilian clothes from the night before, his military ID in his pocket, but his hands empty and visible. The desk sergeant looked up from his computer. "Help you. I need to see Officer Cole Brennan." "Officer Brennan's not available." "Then I need to see whoever's in charge of his case." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" Bryson placed his military ID on the counter. The sergeant looked at it, looked at him, and his entire demeanor changed. "Sir, I don't think... I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm here as the son of Marlene Westfield, the woman Officer Brennan put in a coma yesterday." The sergeant's face went pale. "Sir, you need to go through proper channels. If you have a complaint, there's a process." "I'm aware of the process. I'm also aware that the process has failed to hold anyone accountable in this building for years. So I'm trying something different. I'm asking politely to speak to someone about Officer Brennan's actions." Before the sergeant could respond, a voice came from behind Bryson. "I'll speak with him." Bryson turned to find a woman in her 40s, black with lieutenant's bars on her collar, and eyes that had seen too much. She extended her hand. "Lieutenant Kendra Williams. I'm heading up the internal investigation into yesterday's incident. We can talk in my office." They walked through the precinct in silence, past officers who stopped and stared past bulletin boards covered with commendations and wanted posters, past interrogation rooms where lives were changed and sometimes destroyed. Williams's office was small and cluttered with case files stacked on every surface and a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. She closed the door and gestured to a chair. "I want to say first that I'm sorry. What happened to your mother should never have happened. It's inexcusable." "But," Bryson said, because he could hear the unspoken qualifier. "But my hands are tied by procedure, by union contracts, by a legal system that gives officers extensive protections. I can investigate. I can recommend discipline. I can even recommend termination. But there are layers of review appeals arbitration. Even in a case this clear-cut, it could take months or years to get any real accountability. That's unacceptable." "I agree. But it's reality." Williams leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Between you and me, Cole Brennan should have been fired years ago. I've recommended it twice. Both times it got overturned on appeal. The union claimed procedural errors, insufficient evidence, violation of his rights. He's learned how to work the system. What about the video? What about his statement calling my mother a slur? The video helps tremendously. His statement even more so. But you need to understand we're fighting a culture here. A culture that protects its own no matter what. There are officers in this building right now who think Brennan did nothing wrong. Who think your mother deserved what she got for disrespecting him." Bryson's voice was very quiet when he spoke. "Then the culture needs to change." "Agreed. But culture doesn't change overnight." "Lieutenant Williams, I've spent 20 years changing cultures in places where people actively wanted to kill me. I think I can handle Atlanta PD." He stood. "Thank you for your honesty. But you should know I'm not going to wait for your process. I'm not going to trust that the system will suddenly start working after decades of failure. I'm going to make sure there's so much light on this case that darkness can't hide anything anymore." "What are you planning to do?" "Whatever's necessary." As Bryson left the precinct, he pulled out his phone and made another call. This one went to a different number, a different contact, someone who operated in the gray spaces between official channels and necessary actions. "Marcus, I need your team in Atlanta. Today." The man on the other end. Marcus Shaw, a former investigative journalist who now ran a private firm specializing in exposing corruption, didn't hesitate. "What's the target?" "Atlanta PD. Specifically, the network of officers protecting Cole Brennan. I want every complaint, every buried case, every falsified report exposed. Can you do it?" "Can I do it?" "Brother, this is what I live for. Send me everything you have." By 3:00 p.m., the story had grown into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. The combination of the video, the audio leak, and the mounting evidence of systemic corruption had created a perfect storm. Twitter was exploding with hashtag Justice for Marlene. Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members were organizing. Local news trucks were setting up outside the precinct. National reporters were flying in. And at the hospital, Marlene Westfield lay unconscious, unaware that her name had become a rallying cry. Bryson returned to her room to find it full of flowers. Dozens of bouquets sent by strangers, by veterans who'd served with her in Vietnam, by neighbors from Sweet Auburn, by people across the country who'd seen the video and felt compelled to do anything to show they cared. Laura was changing Marlene's IV when he entered. "It's been like this all day," she said softly. "We've had to move some to other rooms. People keep calling asking about her condition, asking if they can visit. She's become, I don't know how to describe it. A symbol, I guess." "She'd hate that," Bryson said with the faintest hint of a smile. "She always just wanted to be left alone to live her life." "Well, she's not going to get that wish anymore. Not after this." Bryson took his mother's hand, again careful of the IV lines. "Ma, I know you told me not to get involved. I know you said I'm dangerous when I'm angry. And you're right, I am. But sometimes dangerous is what's needed. Sometimes the only way to fight a broken system is to break it further until it can't be ignored anymore." The monitors beeped. The ventilator sighed. Marlene offered no response, no absolution, no permission. At 5:30 p.m., Bryson left the hospital and walked 4 blocks to the precinct. The protest was already gathering hundreds of people, maybe thousands, carrying signs and chanting. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, unnoticed, observing. There were college students and grandmothers. There were white allies and black activists. There were veterans in old uniforms and nurses still in scrubs from their shifts. There were mothers holding children's hands and fathers with daughters on their shoulders. They chanted Marlene's name. They demanded accountability. They refused to be silent. And standing at the edge of the crowd, trying to look casual but failing miserably, was Cole Brennan. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a Falcons jersey, but Bryson recognized him instantly from the surveillance photos. He was with 2 other men, also off-duty officers, judging by their bearing, and they were filming the protest with their phones, laughing at signs, making comments that Bryson couldn't hear but could imagine. Bryson watched them for exactly 30 seconds, memorizing faces, calculating angles. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a text to Sarah. "Brennan's at the protest. Southwest corner. Have your eyes document everything." The response came immediately. "Already on it." At 6:00 p.m. the march began. Thousands of people moving through Atlanta's streets, their voices rising in chants that echoed off buildings. No justice, no peace, no racist police. They marched past City Hall, past the courthouse toward the hospital, where Marlene lay fighting for her life. Bryson followed at a distance, and as he walked, his phone buzzed with updates from his team. Sarah had done her work well. Every news outlet in the country now had access to a comprehensive dossier on Cole Brennan. Every complaint, every lawsuit, every incident that had been swept under the rug. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution was preparing a front-page exposé for tomorrow's edition. CNN was putting together a special report. The floodgates had opened. When the march reached the hospital, the crowd stopped and held a vigil. Someone had brought candles. Someone else had brought a photo of Marlene, an old one from her time in Vietnam, where she stood in fatigues with a medical kit on her back and determination in her eyes. A young woman with a megaphone climbed onto the steps. Marlene Westfield is 73 years old. She's a war veteran. She's a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, and she's in there fighting for her life because an officer chose violence over compassion, chose brutality over humanity. We're here to say, never again. We're here to say, we see you. We're here to say justice will be served. The crowd roared its approval. Bryson stood among them, anonymous in his grief and his rage, and felt something shift. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. This was about every person who'd been brutalized and silenced. Every family that had lost someone to police violence. Every community that had learned to fear the people who were supposed to protect them. His phone rang. It was Marcus Shaw. "Bryson, you need to see what we found. Brennan's not just a bad cop, he's part of a conspiracy. We've got evidence of evidence, tampering, witness intimidation, falsified reports on at least 40 cases. Some of these people are still in prison based on his testimony. This is bigger than we thought. How fast can you get this to the DA? Already done. But Bryson, they're going to fight this hard. The police union is already mobilizing. They're calling this a witch hunt, claiming Brennan's being railroaded. They've got political connections, media allies, resources we can't match. They don't have what we have. And what's that? The truth, Bryson said. And a country that's tired of watching it get buried. He hung up and looked at the hospital, at the windows where his mother lay. Somewhere in that building, machines were breathing for her, medicine was keeping her alive, and doctors were doing everything science could offer. But she was still unconscious, still hovering in that space between life and death. And Bryson realized with sudden clarity that all the justice in the world wouldn't matter if she didn't wake up to see it. He pushed through the crowd and re-entered the hospital, riding the elevator to the ICU with his heart hammering. Laura was at the nurse's station and saw his face. "She's the same," Laura said quickly. "No change." Bryson nodded and walked to his mother's room. He pulled the chair close to her bed and took her hand. "Ma, I need you to fight. I need you to come back. Because there's work to do, and I can't do it without you. I can make Brennan pay. I can change the system. I can tear down every wall that protected him. But none of it means anything if you're not here to see it." His voice cracked. "Please, Ma, please fight." Outside, the vigil continued. Inside, the monitors beeped steadily. And somewhere in Atlanta, in his apartment surrounded by awards and commendations, and the lies he'd told himself for 7 years, Cole Brennan stared at his phone and watched his life disintegrate in real time. The reckoning had begun, and this time there would be nowhere to hide. 3 days after the beating, at 2:47 a.m. on a Friday morning, Marlene Westfield's eyes opened. The first thing she saw was the ceiling tiles of Grady Memorial Hospital, speckled and water-stained, swimming in and out of focus. The second thing she felt was pain, a deep throbbing agony that radiated from her skull down through her entire body like electricity through water. The third thing she heard was a voice rough with exhaustion and relief, saying, "Mama, can you hear me?" She turned her head slowly, fighting through waves of nausea, and found her son sitting beside her bed. Bryson looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days, unshaven, hollow-eyed, still wearing the same clothes she'd last seen him in at Christmas. But his hand was warm around hers, and his eyes were wet, and she realized with distant surprise that she'd never seen him cry, not even at his father's funeral. "Baby," she whispered, her voice like sandpaper on wood. "What happened?" Bryson's laugh was half sob. "You happened, Ma. You scared the hell out of everyone, but you happened. You came back." The nurses flooded in within seconds of the monitors, changing Laura Chen leading the charge, followed by Dr. Webb and 2 residents. They asked questions, shined lights in her eyes, checked her vitals, all while Bryson stood back and watched with the controlled stillness of someone who just won a battle but knew the war wasn't over. "Mrs. Westfield, do you know where you are?" Dr. Webb asked gently. "Hospital," she managed. "Don't know. Which one?" "Do you remember what happened to you?" And there it was. The floodgates opened and memory came rushing back. The grocery store, the sidewalk, the officer's face twisted with rage, the nightstick rising, the pavement rushing up to meet her. She closed her eyes against the images, but they were burned into her retinas like after-images of the sun. "The officer," she said quietly. "He beat me. Because I wouldn't call him sir." Laura caught Bryson's eye. He nodded almost imperceptibly. They had her testimony now. Conscious, coherent, corroborating everything the evidence showed. Over the next hour, as Marlene drifted in and out of awareness, her condition stabilized enough for Dr. Webb to make a preliminary assessment. The brain swelling had reduced. Her cognitive functions appeared intact, though they'd need more time to be certain. The physical injuries would heal given time and therapy. She'd been lucky, if you could call anything about this situation lucky. When they were finally alone again, Marlene reached for Bryson's hand. "I told them not to call you. I didn't want you to know." "I know. Nurse Chen told me you said that right before you slipped under." "You're angry. I can always tell when you're angry, even when you hide it." Bryson was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not angry at you, Ma. I'm angry at a system that let this happen. I'm angry at every person who protected that officer for 7 years while he brutalized people. I'm angry that you're lying in this bed because someone thought a badge gave him the right to assault you. What did you do?" Her voice was sharper now, cutting through the medication haze. "Bryson, what did you do? What needed to be done? I exposed the truth. I made sure the evidence couldn't be buried. I made sure the whole country was watching, so they couldn't make this disappear like all the others." Marlene closed her eyes, and a single tear tracked down her bruised cheek. "I just wanted to go home with my groceries. I just wanted to live my life quietly. Now you're a symbol whether you want to be or not. Now your name means something to people who never knew you existed 3 days ago. Now you're the face of every person who's been abused by someone who was supposed to protect them." "I don't want to be a symbol. I'm tired, baby. I'm so tired." "I know, but sometimes we don't get to choose what we become. Sometimes the moment chooses us." Outside the hospital, dawn was breaking over Atlanta. The vigil had continued through the night, smaller now, but still present, a core group of activists who'd pledged to maintain watch until Marlene woke up. When word spread that she'd regained consciousness, the crowd erupted in cheers and tears. Strangers embracing strangers, everyone bound together by relief and hope, and the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Jerome was there, had been there every night, sometimes sleeping on the hospital steps, because his mother insisted someone needed to bear witness. When his phone lit up with the news, he started crying so hard he couldn't speak, could only nod when the woman next to him asked if he was okay. Across town, in a different kind of vigil, Cole Brennan sat in his apartment with the lights off and the blinds drawn, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and watching his phone blow up with notifications he couldn't bear to read. His union rep had called 6 times. His lawyer had called 8. His mother had called once and left a voicemail saying, "Cole, honey, what's going on? Are you okay?" that he'd deleted without listening to the end. He wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. The audio of his slur had been played on every major network. The ACLU had filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The district attorney, a black woman named Patricia Hamilton, who'd built her career on police accountability, had announced a grand jury investigation. And worst of all, victims were coming forward. People he'd arrested, people he'd beaten, people he'd terrorized, were suddenly finding their voices, telling their stories, and every story made him look worse. There was Marcus Johnson, who'd been 17 when Brennan broke his orbital bone during a traffic stop and then charged him with assaulting an officer. Marcus had taken a plea deal to avoid prison, had lived with a criminal record that destroyed his college prospects and job opportunities, and was now standing in front of cameras saying, "I told the truth 6 years ago and nobody listened. Maybe they'll listen now." There was Jennifer Walsh, the white woman Brennan had strip-searched on the roadside. She'd signed an NDA as part of her settlement, but her lawyer had found a loophole that let her speak without violating the agreement. She appeared on CNN looking haunted and brave, describing the humiliation and violation in detail that made the anchor's hands shake. There was Tyrone Davis, who'd spent 3 years in prison, based largely on Brennan's testimony, until Marcus Shaw's investigation revealed that key evidence had been planted and witness statements falsified. Tyrone's conviction was being reviewed for reversal, and he was calling for criminal charges against every officer involved in the frame-up. The victims kept coming, kept speaking, kept demanding justice. And Brennan, sitting in his dark apartment, realized for the first time in his life that he might actually face consequences. His phone rang. His lawyer, David Casper, a bulldog of a man who specialized in defending cops. Brennan answered on the 5th ring. "You need to get out of town," Casper said without preamble. "Today. Right now." "What? No. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not running. Cole listened to me very carefully. The grand jury is convening Monday. They're going to indict you not just for assault, but for civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy, the whole package. The DA has enough evidence to put you away for 20 years. Your only play right now is to take a deal. A deal? I'm not taking any deal. I want to fight this. Fight it with what? Casper's voice was sharp. They have video of the assault. They have audio of you using racial slurs. They have testimony from a dozen victims corroborating a pattern of abuse. They have evidence that you and your buddies have been running a protection racket inside the department. What exactly is your defense here? Brennan's hand tightened on the bottle. She was resisting arrest. I followed protocol. Cole, she was carrying groceries. She's 73 years old. She's a decorated veteran who served her country while you were still in diapers. And her son is a goddamn general who apparently has access to resources that are making my job impossible. Every time we think we've got something buried, it resurfaces. Every witness we discredit, two more appear. This isn't a normal case. So what are you saying? I'm saying take the deal. Plead to reduced charges. Do your time, get out while you're still young enough to have a life. Because if you go to trial, they're going to crucify you. Brennan hung up without responding and threw his phone across the room. It hit the wall and shattered plastic shards scattering across his floor like his life. The grand jury convened on Monday, October 21st in a federal courthouse that had been surrounded by protesters since dawn. District Attorney Patricia Hamilton presented her case over 3 days, calling witness after witness, entering exhibit after exhibit into evidence. The jurors, 12 ordinary citizens from across the district, sat in stunned silence as the full scope of corruption was laid bare before them. Robert Ashford, representing the ACLU, provided testimony about the systemic failures that had allowed Brennan to operate with impunity. Lieutenant Kendra Williams testified about complaints that had been dismissed, investigations that had been derailed, warnings that had been ignored. Jerome testified about what he'd witnessed, his voice steady, even as his hands shook. Laura Chen testified about the medical evidence about injuries that didn't match the official report about a system that prioritized protecting officers over truth. And on the third day, Marlene Westfield herself appeared. She was in a wheelchair, her face still bruised, though the swelling had gone down, her voice soft but clear, as she recounted every detail of that Tuesday morning. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. And when she described the moment the nightstick struck her head, several jurors were seen wiping tears from their eyes. I asked him to stop, she said quietly. I said please, but he didn't stop. He was enjoying it. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to hurt me because I didn't bow down to him, because I treated him like a human being instead of a king. Bryson sat in the front row, his face impassive, but his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. When Marlene finished her testimony and was wheeled past him, she reached out and touched his shoulder. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, a conversation happened without words. She was telling him she was strong enough. He was telling her he was proud. The grand jury deliberated for 47 minutes. When they returned, the foreperson, a middle-aged black woman who taught elementary school, read the indictments in a clear, unwavering voice. Cole Brennan was charged with aggravated assault, civil rights violations, deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and 8 counts of perjury related to falsified reports. His partner, Mike Reynolds, was charged as an accessory. 4 other officers in their unit were charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The total possible sentence, if convicted on all counts, was 43 years. When the news broke, Atlanta erupted. Not in violence, but in something more powerful: vindication. People poured into the streets not to protest, but to celebrate, to bear witness to the unprecedented moment when the system had actually worked. Church bells rang in Sweet Auburn. Strangers embraced. Parents told their children, "Remember this day. Remember that justice is possible." But the hardest battle still lay ahead. A grand jury indictment was one thing. A conviction was another. Brennan pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his defense team, now led by a high-powered attorney named Richard Crane, who'd successfully defended 3 cops in similar cases, began mounting an aggressive strategy. They argued that Brennan had feared for his safety, that Marlene had exhibited erratic behavior, that the video was taken out of context, that his use of slurs was protected speech that had no bearing on his actions, that this was a politically motivated prosecution designed to appease the mob. The trial began on January 14, 2026, in the federal courthouse downtown. Judge Sarah Morrison presided, a 70-year-old black woman who'd been on the bench for 26 years and who began each day by reading the Constitution aloud to remind everyone what they were there to defend. The prosecution was led by D.A. Hamilton and a team of federal prosecutors who'd been brought in to assist. They presented their case with methodical precision, building a narrative brick by brick. They showed the video, the full unedited version that lasted 2 minutes and 47 seconds and left no room for interpretation. They played the audio of Brennan's slur. They presented medical evidence expert testimony, forensic analysis that proved beyond doubt that Marlene's injuries came from being beaten, not from a fall. And then they called the other victims. Marcus Johnson took the stand and described his assault with such specificity that several jurors looked sick. Jennifer Walsh testified about her strip search, about the shame and violation that still haunted her 6 years later. Tyrone Davis explained how Brennan had planted a gun in his car and then lied on the stand to secure a conviction. One by one they came forward, 12 victims total spanning 7 years, painting a portrait of a man who'd used his badge as a weapon and his uniform as armor against accountability. The defense tried to discredit them, tried to point out criminal records, past drug use, inconsistencies in their statements. But the sheer weight of testimony, the obvious pattern of abuse, the documented evidence of corruption, it was overwhelming. On the 4th day of testimony, Bryson took the stand. Not as a general, not as a military commander, but as a son describing what it felt like to watch his mother be beaten on video. Crane, the defense attorney, tried to rattle him during cross-examination. "General Westfield, isn't it true that you used your military position to conduct illegal surveillance on my client?" "I used lawfully authorized tools to gather information on a domestic threat." "You consider a police officer a domestic threat?" "I consider anyone who brutalizes innocent citizens and then lies about it a domestic threat regardless of what uniform they wear." "Isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against my client?" Bryson looked directly at Brennan for the first time. Held his gaze with eyes that had seen horrors Brennan couldn't imagine, and faced them without flinching. "I don't have a vendetta. I have a commitment to justice. If your client hadn't beaten my mother, we wouldn't be here. If your client hadn't spent 7 years abusing his authority, we wouldn't be here. If your client had shown even a moment of remorse or accountability, we wouldn't be here. But he did and he didn't, so here we are." The courtroom was silent. Even Crane seemed at a loss for a follow-up question. On the 7th day, Brennan took the stand in his own defense. It was a calculated risk, but his team had decided it was necessary. The jury needed to hear from him, needed to see him as human, needed to understand his perspective. It backfired spectacularly. Under direct examination from Crane, Brennan presented as coached and rehearsed, reciting the approved narrative about fearing for his safety and following his training. But under cross-examination from Hamilton, the mask cracked. Officer Brennan, Mrs. Westfield, was 73 years old and carrying groceries. What specifically about her made you fear for your safety? She was being aggressive. She wouldn't comply with my orders. She wouldn't call you sir. That's what made you fear for your safety. Being called officer instead of sir. It's about respect for the badge. And when she didn't show you what you considered adequate respect, you felt entitled to beat her unconscious. I didn't beat her. I used appropriate force to subdue a resistant subject. Hamilton pulled up a still image from the video the moment Brennan's nightstick was raised above Marlene's head. Is this appropriate force? A nightstick to the skull of an elderly woman. She was resisting. She was pulling away from you because you were hurting her. That's not resistance. That's self-preservation. And you responded by escalating to potentially lethal force. Hamilton's voice rose. You responded by beating her so badly she spent 3 days in a coma. You responded by fracturing her skull and breaking her ribs and leaving her bleeding on a sidewalk. And then you lied about it. You filed a report saying she attacked you when the video clearly shows she did no such thing. Brennan's face flushed red. She should have just complied. With what? Your demand that she debase herself by calling you sir. Your illegal detention without cause. Your assault. I was doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve Officer Brennan, not to brutalize and terrorize. Hamilton paused, letting the words hang in the air. Tell me, do you feel any remorse for what you did to Mrs. Westfield? The question hung there like a trap. Bryson, watching from the gallery, saw the calculation happening behind Brennan's eyes, saw him trying to decide what answer would play better, genuine remorse or righteous defiance. He chose wrong. I regret that it had to happen the way it did, but I was just enforcing the law. You regret that it had to happen, as if it were inevitable, as if you had no choice but to beat an innocent woman. She made her choices. No, Officer Brennan, you made your choices. You chose violence. You chose cruelty. You chose to abuse your power. And now you're choosing to take no responsibility for the consequences. The cross-examination continued for another 2 hours, and by the end of it, Brennan looked like he'd gone 15 rounds with a heavyweight champion. His carefully constructed defense had been dismantled piece by piece, and the jury had seen exactly who he was. Not the victim of a witch hunt, but a man who genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. The closing arguments took place on January 28th. Crane gave an impassioned speech about the challenges of policing, the split-second decisions officers have to make, the dangers they face every day. He painted Brennan as a dedicated officer, caught in an unfortunate situation, vilified by a media mob, and prosecuted for political reasons. Then, Hamilton stood up, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending this is a complicated case. You've seen the video. You've heard the testimony. You know exactly what happened on that Tuesday morning. Officer Brennan beat Marlene Westfield nearly to death because she didn't show him sufficient deference. Not because she was dangerous. Not because she was armed. Not because she posed any threat whatsoever. But because she treated him like a public servant instead of a king. She walked to where the exhibits were displayed, photos of Marlene's injuries, stills from the video, medical reports. This is not about the challenges of policing. This is about a man who spent 7 years abusing his authority and finally got caught. This is about a system that protected him every step of the way until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. This is about accountability. Hamilton turned to face the jury directly. Corrupt systems don't begin with cruelty. They begin with silent agreement. They begin when good people see wrong being done and decide it's not their problem. They begin when we prioritize order over justice, when we value the badge over the person, when we accept that some people are above the law. She paused, letting the words settle. Marlene Westfield survived Vietnam. She survived poverty and racism and widowhood. She served her country with honor. And she nearly died on a sidewalk in the city she called home because one officer decided his ego was more important than her life. That's not policing. That's terrorism. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was so packed people were standing in the aisles, pressed against the walls, sitting on the floor. Bryson sat next to his mother, who'd insisted on being present despite Dr. Webb's concerns. She wanted to see this through. Judge Morrison called for order. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of aggravated assault, how do you find guilty? A ripple went through the courtroom. Marlene reached for Bryson's hand. On the charge of civil rights violations, guilty. Deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. Count after count, the foreperson's voice rang clear and certain. Guilty, guilty, guilty. By the end, Brennan was convicted on all charges. His accomplices were convicted on conspiracy and obstruction. The system that had protected them for so long had finally held them accountable. Brennan sat frozen at the defense table, his face drained of color. Behind him, his mother was sobbing. His lawyer sat with his head in his hands. And across the aisle, victims were embracing crying, allowing themselves to believe that maybe their pain had meant something after all. Judge Morrison called for order again, and when the room quieted, she spoke words that would be quoted in law schools and civil rights discussions for years to come. I want to address everyone in this courtroom and everyone watching across this country. What happened to Marlene Westfield was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a system that has for too long placed the protection of officers above the protection of citizens. A system that treats badges as shields against accountability rather than symbols of public trust. She looked directly at Brennan. Mr. Brennan, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. But your guilt extends beyond the legal definitions we've discussed here. You are guilty of betraying the oath you took. You are guilty of weaponizing a position of trust. You are guilty of demonstrating through your actions and your words that you view certain citizens as less deserving of dignity and respect. That guilt will follow you far beyond whatever sentence I impose. Morrison paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of 26 years on the bench and 70 years of life in America. Corrupt systems don't begin with cruelty. They begin with silent agreement. They persist because good people decide that speaking up is too risky, that change is too hard, that their comfort is more important than someone else's justice. But systems can change. They must change. And they change when ordinary people decide that silence is no longer acceptable. She set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later, and when the trial finally adjourned, the crowd outside erupted. Not in celebration, this wasn't something to celebrate, but in relief. In vindication. In the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this was a turning point. Bryson helped his mother to her wheelchair, and as they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed with microphones and questions. But Marlene raised her hand, and somehow, in that simple gesture, she commanded silence. I don't want to be a symbol, she said, her voice still soft, but carrying in the sudden quiet. I just want to be a person who can walk down the street without fear. I want that for everyone, not because of who their son is or how much attention their case gets, but because it's right. Because we all deserve to live with dignity. She looked up at Bryson, then back at the cameras. Justice isn't about standing up. It's about not staying down. And we're not staying down anymore. Then they left mother and son moving through a crowd that parted to let them pass. And somewhere in America, in cities and towns, large and small, people watching on screens and phones allowed themselves to believe that change was possible after all. The sentencing hearing took place on February 18, 2026, on a morning that felt suspended between winter and spring. The courthouse was packed again, but the energy was different this time, quieter, heavier. Like everyone understood they were witnessing not just the end of a trial, but the beginning of something harder to define. Cole Brennan sat at the defense table looking smaller than he had during the trial, diminished somehow, as if the guilty verdict had physically shrunk him. His mother sat in the front row behind him, her face carved from grief and confusion, unable to reconcile the son she'd raised with the man the evidence had revealed him to be. His lawyer sat beside him, with the resigned posture of someone who knew exactly how this would end. Across the aisle, Marlene sat in her wheelchair next to Bryson, her recovery progressing, but still incomplete. The doctors said she'd need months of physical therapy to regain her full strength. And there were cognitive effects that might never fully heal, moments when words escaped her, times when her balance failed, headaches that arrived without warning and left her gasping. But she was alive and she was here, and that was more than anyone had dared hope for in those first dark days. Judge Morrison entered, and the bailiff called for everyone to rise. The ritual of it felt important somehow. This formal acknowledgement that what happened next mattered, that justice required ceremony and weight. Morrison settled into her chair and looked at Brennan for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Brennan, before I impose sentence, the law allows you to make a statement if you choose. Do you wish to address the court? Brennan's lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgently. Brennan shook his head, started to stand, then sat back down. The internal war played out across his face, the part of him that still believed he'd done nothing wrong, fighting with the part that finally understood the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. Finally he stood. His voice was rough, uncertain, nothing like the aggressive confidence that had marked his testimony. Your Honor, I've had a lot of time to think. To really think about what happened, and what it means, and what He faltered, looked at his lawyer, who nodded encouragement. I was raised to believe the badge meant something, that it gave you authority and respect and the right to be obeyed. My father was a cop. My grandfather was a cop. They taught me that the world was divided into good guys and bad guys, and we were the good guys, so whatever we did was justified. He turned slightly, not quite looking at Marlene, but acknowledging her presence. But I was wrong, about a lot of things. I thought respect was something you could demand, could force out of people. I thought being feared was the same as being respected. I thought my uniform made me better than the people I was supposed to serve. And I thought some people deserved less dignity than others because of the color of their skin. Someone in the gallery made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. Brennan swallowed hard and continued. I can't take back what I did. I can't undo the damage or erase the pain, Mrs. Westfield. I know sorry doesn't mean anything to you, and I know you have no reason to believe me, but I am sorry. Not because I got caught or because I'm facing prison, but because I hurt you. Because I brutalized someone who'd served this country with honor, who deserved nothing but respect and protection, and I gave her violence instead. He looked at Morrison now. I know I'm going to prison. I know I deserve it. But I want to say for the record, and for anyone watching, that this system is broken. Not because it convicted me I'm guilty, and the jury was right, but because it protected me for so long. Because I filed 14 complaints and walked away from all of them. Because I hurt people and lied about it and got promoted anyway. Because the culture of policing rewards aggression and punishes honesty, and until that changes, there will be more cases like mine. It wasn't quite remorse, not fully, not yet, but it was closer than anyone had expected, and in the stunned silence that followed, Marlene did something that shocked everyone in that courtroom. She spoke. Your Honor, may I respond? Morrison's eyebrows rose. Mrs. Westfield, you're not required to. I know, but I'd like to if that's permitted. Of course. Bryson helped his mother stand, supporting her with one arm as she faced Brennan directly. Her voice was steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Officer Brennan, you're right that sorry doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't heal my body or restore the months of my life I'll spend in recovery. It doesn't give me back my sense of safety in my own neighborhood. But it's a start. Acknowledgement is a start. She paused, gathering strength. I've spent 50 years working in communities torn apart by violence, in war zones, in poverty, in places where people had every reason to hate and hurt each other. And I learned that healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from truth and accountability, and the hard work of becoming better than we were. You standing there admitting what you did, admitting the system failed, that matters. Not because it changes my past, but because it might change someone else's future. Tears were streaming down Brennan's mother's face. Several jurors in the gallery were crying openly. Even Morrison had to clear her throat before speaking. Mrs. Westfield, thank you. Your grace in the face of such injustice is humbling. She turned back to Brennan. Mr. Brennan, I've presided over hundreds of cases in my 26 years on this bench. I've heard countless defendants express remorse, and I've learned to distinguish between genuine reflection and strategic performance. What you said today, I believe you meant it. I believe you're beginning to understand the gravity of your actions. She picked up a document from her desk. However, understanding does not erase consequence. You committed serious crimes, not in a moment of panic or fear, but as part of a pattern of abuse that spanned 7 years. You violated your oath. You weaponized your authority. You terrorized vulnerable people and then hid behind a system designed to protect you. The sentence I impose must reflect not only what you did, but what you represent, the corruption that occurs when power goes unchecked. Morrison's voice took on formal weight. On the charge of aggravated assault, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison. On the charges of civil rights violations, deprivation of rights under color of law, and conspiracy, I sentence you to concurrent terms totaling 15 years. On the charges of evidence tampering and perjury, consecutive terms of 3 years. Total sentence 18 years with possibility of parole after 12. The courtroom erupted. Brennan's mother collapsed in sobs. His lawyer closed his eyes in resignation. Across the aisle, victims embraced each other with the complicated mix of vindication and sorrow that comes from winning a fight no one should have had to wage. But Morrison wasn't finished. She raised her gavel and called for order. Furthermore, I am recommending that the Department of Justice conduct a comprehensive investigation into the Atlanta Police Department's disciplinary procedures and oversight mechanisms. The systemic failures that allowed Mr. Brennan to operate with impunity for 7 years cannot be addressed through individual prosecution alone. Real change requires institutional transformation. She looked out at the packed courtroom. To the officers present today, I say this: the badge is a symbol of public trust, not a shield against accountability. You have been given tremendous power and authority. With that comes tremendous responsibility. If you see corruption, speak up. If you see abuse, intervene. If you value the uniform, prove it by holding yourselves and each other to the highest standards. Because the alternative, the path Mr. Brennan chose, leads only to destruction. The gavel came down with finality. Court is adjourned. As the marshals led Brennan away in handcuffs, he looked back once at his mother, who was being supported by relatives on either side. Then he looked at Marlene, and for just a moment, their eyes met. What passed between them was wordless and complex: his shame and her pain, and the unbridgeable distance between causing harm and receiving it. Then he was gone, disappearing through a side door that led to holding cells, and eventually to a federal prison in South Carolina, where he would spend the next dozen years learning what it felt like to be powerless. The aftermath of the trial spread through Atlanta like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Within weeks, the Department of Justice had opened its investigation into the Atlanta PD, and what they found shocked even the most cynical observers. The corruption went deeper than anyone had suspected, not just individual bad actors, but systemic practices designed to protect officers at the expense of citizens. Use of force, reports that were routinely falsified, complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, an internal culture that treated whistleblowers as traitors and brutality as acceptable collateral damage. The DOJ report, released 6 months later, ran to 473 pages and included the damning conclusion that the department had engaged in a pattern and practice of civil rights violations. It mandated sweeping reforms: body cameras that couldn't be turned off, independent oversight boards with real authority, revised use of force policies, mandatory de-escalation training, and a complete overhaul of the disciplinary system. Police Chief Raymond Carter resigned rather than implement the reforms. So did his deputy. So did 14 other senior officers who'd been complicit in the culture of corruption. They were replaced by a new generation of leadership, including Lieutenant Kendra Williams, who became the city's first black female police chief, and who made it her mission to rebuild trust between the department and the communities it served. But the impact extended far beyond Atlanta. Cities across America watching the trial and its aftermath began examining their own departments with new scrutiny. Baltimore launched an investigation. Chicago revised its oversight procedures. Los Angeles created a civilian review board with subpoena power. It wasn't a revolution. Institutional change never is, but it was movement momentum, the slow grinding of gears that had been rusted in place for decades. And at the center of it all, largely unseen by the cameras and reporters who'd moved on to newer stories, Marlene Westfield worked quietly on her recovery. Physical therapy 3 times a week at Grady Memorial, where Laura Chen had arranged for her to work with the best therapist in the hospital. Cognitive exercises to rebuild the neural pathways damaged by the head trauma. Walks around her neighborhood tentative at first, then growing longer and more confident, though Bryson insisted on accompanying her for the first month, until she finally told him gently but firmly that she needed to reclaim her independence. The hardest part wasn't physical. It was emotional, psychological, the invisible scars that didn't show up on CT scans or medical charts. There were nights when she woke up gasping, reliving the moment the nightstick connected with her skull. Days when she couldn't make herself leave the apartment because the sidewalk felt dangerous, because every police siren made her flinch, because the world that had once felt safe now felt hostile and unpredictable. Bryson wanted to stay, wanted to take leave and help her through it, but she refused. "Baby, you have your work. You have people depending on you. I survived Vietnam and 73 years of life in America. I can survive this too." "Ma, you don't have to survive alone." "I'm not alone. I've got the whole neighborhood checking on me. Jerome stops by 3 times a week. Laura comes for coffee. Even Mr. Chen brings me vegetables from his garden." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "What I need isn't protection, it's purpose. I need to feel useful again." So she found purpose. Small at first, helping Jerome with his college applications, since his video and testimony had made him a target for both admiration and harassment at school. Reading to children at the neighborhood library on Saturday mornings, the same way she used to when Bryson was young. Volunteering at a clinic that served veterans, using her medical training to help people who reminded her of herself, survivors carrying invisible wounds, trying to find their way in a world that didn't always understand what they'd been through. And slowly, incrementally, she healed. Not completely, she would never be completely healed, and she'd made peace with that. But enough. Enough to reclaim her life. Enough to walk down Auburn Avenue without fear. Enough to buy groceries from Green's family store and carry them home with her head high and her heart steady. 8 months after the trial, on a crisp October morning that could have been the anniversary of her attack, except it was a day earlier, Marlene stood on the steps of a new building in downtown Atlanta. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy, established as part of the DOJ reforms, designed to train officers in de-escalation, community policing, and constitutional rights. The building was modern glass and steel, but one wall, the wall facing the street, was different. It was black granite, polished to a mirror shine, and carved into its surface were hundreds of names. Not the names of fallen officers, there were plenty of memorials for them already. These were the names of civilians killed by police violence. Men, women, children. Black, white, Latino, indigenous, Asian. Each name representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a failure of the system meant to protect them. At the top of the wall, in letters slightly larger than the rest, were the words, "You have the right to live, not because you're someone's mother." Marlene stood before the wall with Bryson beside her, both of them silent as they read name after name. Eric, Tamir, Brianna, Philando, Sandra, Michael. The list went on and on, a litany of loss and failure, and the slow, painful work of trying to do better. "They wanted to put your name up there," Bryson said quietly. "I told them no." "Why?" "Because you're alive, because you get to tell your own story instead of being a name on a wall." He paused. "But if you want it there, no." Marlene touched the granite, gently feeling the coolness of the stone, the permanence of the names carved into it. "You were right. This wall is for people who didn't get the chance I got. For people whose sons weren't generals with the resources to demand accountability. For people whose cases got buried and forgotten." She looked at the names, and her voice was soft. "I'm here because of luck and privilege and timing. They're not. This wall should honor them." The dedication ceremony began at 10. City officials spoke about reform and progress. Chief Williams spoke about the department's commitment to change. A mother whose son's name was on the wall spoke about grief and the long road toward healing. And finally, they called on Marlene. She'd been told she could decline, that there was no obligation, but she'd prepared remarks anyway, written them out by hand at her kitchen table in the early morning hours when sleep wouldn't come. Now she stood at the podium with Bryson's steadying hand on her back and looked out at the crowd of cadets, officers, community members, and press. "I've been asked to speak about justice today," she began, her voice carrying across the plaza through the microphone system. "And I've spent weeks trying to figure out what to say, because justice is complicated. It's not simple. It's not clean. It's not always satisfying." She looked at the wall of names. Those people up there, they didn't get justice. Their families are still waiting, still fighting, still hoping that maybe this time will be different. And I can't tell them it will be. I can't promise that the reforms we've implemented will prevent every tragedy that the training will reach, every officer that the culture will change overnight. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I can tell you what I learned from my experience. I learned that silence is complicity, that good people staying quiet allows bad people to flourish. I learned that institutional change requires individual courage. People like Officer Martinez, who recorded and leaked evidence, like Lieutenant Williams, who testified against her colleagues like Jerome, who filmed what he saw, even though he knew it would make him a target. Her voice strengthened. I learned that justice isn't about standing up. It's about not staying down. It's about getting back up every time the world knocks you over. It's about refusing to accept that cruelty is inevitable, or that power is absolute, or that some people matter less than others. She looked directly at the police cadets in the front rows. Young men and women who'd chosen this profession despite everything, who were here to learn how to do it better. You're entering a profession that's been poisoned by corruption and racism and violence. You could walk away. Nobody would blame you. But instead, you're here trying to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. That takes courage. Marlene's hands gripped the podium. But courage isn't enough. You need to commit. Truly commit to serving every person with dignity and respect. Rich or poor, black or white, homeless or housed, polite or rude. Every single person you encounter deserves to be treated as a human being with inherent worth. Not because of who their son is, not because cameras are watching, but because it's right. Because that's what the badge is supposed to mean. She stepped back from the podium to thunderous applause, but she barely heard it. She was looking at the wall, at all those names, and thinking about the long road ahead. This wasn't the end of anything. It was barely the beginning. But it was a beginning, and that mattered. After the ceremony, as Marlene was preparing to leave, a young black woman approached hesitantly. She was maybe 23, wearing a police cadet uniform with nervous energy radiating off her like heat. "Mrs. Westfield, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to say thank you. My little brother, he's on that wall. Jamal Peterson. He was 17 when he was killed during a traffic stop. The officer said he reached for something, but he was just getting his wallet, just following orders." Marlene took the young woman's hands. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you. But the thing is, after Jamal died, I could have let it make me bitter. Could have let it make me hate all cops, hate the system, just give up. But watching your case, seeing how you fought for accountability, but didn't let it destroy you, it gave me hope that maybe I could be part of changing things from the inside. So I applied to the academy. I'm going to be a police officer, but I'm going to be the kind Jamal deserved to meet that day." Tears were streaming down both their faces now. Marlene pulled the young woman into a hug, and they stood there for a long moment. Two people bound by grief and hope, and the stubborn belief that the world could be better than it was. "Your brother would be proud of you," Marlene whispered. "I think he would be proud of you too." 6 months later, on a warm spring evening, Marlene sat on the porch of her apartment with a book in her lap and a glass of sweet tea sweating on the railing beside her. Children played in the street, the same children who used to scatter when police cars drove by now, laughing and shouting without fear. Mr. Chen tended his garden next door, occasionally calling over advice about tomatoes that Marlene had no intention of following, but appreciated anyway. Jerome arrived on his bicycle, now a freshman at Morehouse College, on a full scholarship funded by donations from people who'd seen his courage and wanted to invest in his future. He bounded up the steps with the energy of someone still young enough to believe the world was full of possibilities. "Mrs. Westfield, you seen the news?" "Baby, I try not to watch too much news. It's bad for my blood pressure." "You'll want to see this." He pulled out his phone and showed her a headline. "Tyrone Davis exonerated, awarded $2.3 million settlement in wrongful conviction case." Marlene read the article slowly, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Tyrone was one of the victims who'd testified at Brennan's trial, whose conviction had been overturned when evidence of tampering emerged. He'd spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and now finally the system was acknowledging its failure. "That's good," she said quietly. "That's really good. Money can't give him back those years, but at least it's something. At least it's acknowledgement." There's going to be more cases reviewed too. They found evidence that Brennan and his unit falsified reports in at least 60 arrests. 60, Mrs. Westfield. How many people are sitting in prison right now because of lies? Too many. But every case they review, every conviction they overturn, every person they release, that's progress. Slow progress, but progress. Jerome sat on the steps, his youthful optimism tempered now by understanding of how hard change really was. You ever wonder if it was worth it? Everything you went through, everything that happened, was it worth it, if the system still let so many people down? Marlene was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play, watching the neighborhood live its life. "Baby, let me tell you something I learned in Vietnam. You can't save everyone. You can't fix every problem. Sometimes people die even when you do everything right. And if you let that paralyze you, if you give up because you can't achieve perfection, then you save nobody. You fix nothing." She set down her book and looked at him directly. "Was it worth it? I'll never know. I can't see all the ripples, all the changes my case might have triggered. But I know Tyrone's getting his life back. I know new policies are being implemented. I know young officers are being trained differently. I know that maybe somewhere in America, there's a police officer who saw what happened to me and decided to treat people with more compassion. And maybe that's enough. Maybe doing what we can when we can has to be enough." Jerome nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom. "My mom says you're the strongest person she's ever met." "Your mom's never met herself, apparently." Marlene smiled. "Strength isn't about taking the hit, Jerome. It's about what you do after. It's about whether you let the hit break you, or whether you use it to build something better." A car pulled up Bryson visiting for the weekend, from wherever his work had taken him this month. He climbed out with a bag of takeout from Marlene's favorite restaurant and a smile that softened his usually stern features. "Ma, I told you I'd cook dinner. And I told you your cooking is terrible. I'm doing us both a favor accepting takeout." Jerome laughed and stood. "I'll leave you two alone. Mrs. Westfield, thanks for the talk." "Anytime, baby. You keep making us proud." As Jerome rode away and Bryson settled into the chair next to hers, Marlene felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not the absence of pain or the erasure of trauma, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing. You survived something that tried to destroy you and emerged still human, still hopeful, still able to find joy in sweet tea and spring evenings and the sound of children playing. "How you feeling, Ma?" "Tired. Always tired these days, but good tired. Living tired, not dying tired." Bryson reached over and took her hand. "You know there's a reporter from the New York Times who wants to interview you. Write a long-form piece about the trial and the aftermath and what it all means." "I know. Laura told me. I'm thinking about saying yes." "Really? You've turned down every interview request for months." "I have, because I needed time to heal to figure out what I wanted to say. But maybe now, I'm ready to tell the story the way it should be told. Not as a sensational tragedy or a viral video, but as a reminder of what happens when systems fail and what it takes to make them better. She squeezed his hand. Besides, if I don't tell my story, someone else will, and they'll probably get it wrong. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the city, police officers were starting their shifts, some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. Somewhere activists were organizing, demanding continued reform. Somewhere families were gathering for dinner, grateful for another day without tragedy. And in a federal prison in South Carolina, Cole Brennan sat in his cell and wrote another letter to his mother, trying to find words for regret that had taken him 33 years to feel. The world kept turning. The work kept going. Justice remained incomplete, and probably always would be, because justice was a direction to travel rather than a destination to reach. But on Marlene Westfield's porch, on that spring evening, watching the neighborhood she loved come alive in the golden hour, she allowed herself to believe that the direction was right. That the movement, however slow, was forward. That her pain had meant something, would continue to mean something long after the cameras stopped recording and the headlines moved on. A journalist did eventually ask her months later what justice meant to her now. Marlene thought about it carefully before answering the way she thought about everything these days, with the deliberation of someone who'd learned that words mattered, that stories shaped reality, that the narratives we tell ourselves become the world we create. Justice isn't about standing up, she said finally, her voice steady and sure. It's about not staying down. It's about getting back up, helping others, get back up and building a world where fewer people get knocked down in the first place. It's not perfect. It's not clean. It's not always satisfying. But it's necessary. It's ongoing. And it's worth fighting for every single day, in every small way we can. The interview ended. The journalist packed up her equipment, and Marlene returned to her life, the quiet, ordinary life of a 74-year-old woman who'd become, despite herself, a symbol of something larger than any one person could carry alone. But she didn't carry it alone. She carried it with Jerome and Laura and Bryson and Chief Williams and every person who'd stood up when silence was easier. She carried it with every reformed policy and every cadet who graduated from the academy with her words echoing in their mind. She carried it with every victim whose name was carved in black granite and every family still waiting for accountability. And in carrying it together, they made it lighter. Not easy, but lighter. Not finished, but ongoing. Not perfect, but better than it was, and always moving towards something that looked a little more like justice every day.